What is carbon dating? It is a process of knowing the age of an organic substance. How it works? First, we have to understand about carbon atom. Everything in this world that has mass in it is made out of atoms. And atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which have their small amount of mass. Protons and neutrons are the center part of an atom, and they are called the nucleus of an atom. Electrons, on the other hand, revolve around the nucleus freely, and it can travel from one atom to another. The number of protons in an atom determines which element is it. For example, if an atom has 1 proton, then it is a hydrogen atom and its atomic number is 1. If an atom has 6 protons, then it is a carbon atom with atomic number being 6. Similarly, if it has 79 protons, then it is gold. What about neutrons? Well, neutrons do not change the element, but it determines its isotopes. For example, there are 3 types of hydrogen atoms commonly found in nature, meaning 3 isotopes of hydrogen. They are hydrogen 1 with 1 proton and 0 neutron, hydrogen 2 with 1 proton and 1 neutron, and hydrogen 3 with 1 proton and 2 neutrons. These numbers 1, 2, and 3 after hydrogen are just sums of protons and neutrons. What about electrons? Electrons are free to move, and they help to combine 2 or more atoms. Similarly, isotopes of carbon atoms commonly found in nature are carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Here, in hydrogen atoms, hydrogen-3 is unstable, and in carbon atoms, carbon-14 is unstable, while carbon-13 is slightly unstable. What is unstable? Look, a lighter atom like hydrogen and carbon, which has few protons, requires an equal or almost equal number of neutrons to that of protons to become stable. So the carbon atom, which has 6 protons, is stable with 6 neutrons, and with 7 neutrons, it is slightly unstable, and with 8 neutrons, it is unstable. In the case of hydrogen 1 and 2 atoms, which have 1 proton, is stable with 0 or 1 neutron, and hydrogen 3, which has 2 neutrons, is unstable. Hydrogen 1 is stable with 0 neutrons because only 1 proton is stable on its own. Heavier atoms have more protons, hence it has more mass. Unlike lighter atoms, heavier atoms require more neutrons than protons to become stable. How are some atoms unstable and why heavier atoms require more neutrons to become stable? To understand this, we have to know how protons and neutrons are bound or attached together in the nucleus of an atom. Just like gravitational force and electromagnetic force, there exists a strong nuclear force between these tiny particles, protons and neutrons. This strong nuclear force binds these protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom. This nuclear force exists not only between protons and neutrons, but also between protons and between neutrons and neutrons as well. But this force between protons and between neutrons and neutrons is weaker than between protons and neutrons. Stronger the bond between protons and neutrons in the nucleus, the more stable they are. So, a strong bond is created between an equal or almost equal number of protons and neutrons inside the nucleus. If the number of protons and neutrons is uneven, then the nuclear force is distributed between them, and their bond becomes weaker and weaker the bond the unstable it gets. In other words, the nucleus naturally tends to get a stronger bond or stable if their current bond is weak or unstable. Note that unstable means radioactive. Let's take an example of a carbon atom. Carbon-12, which has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, is stable, and it makes up about 98% of total existing carbon atoms on Earth. Carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons. It is slightly unstable, and it exists around 1% of total carbon atom. Carbon-14 exists around less than 1% of total carbon atom, or 1 carbon-14 atom for every 1 trillion carbon-12 atoms. It has 6 protons and 8 neutrons, making it unstable, and hence it is radioactive. Radioactive simply means unstable atoms could release radiation by becoming stable at any time within its time period. The process of becoming stable includes the releases of energy in the form of radiation, and this process is called radioactive decay. If we look at carbon-14 atom, we see it has 2 more neutrons than protons. These 2 extra neutrons disbalance the strong nuclear force of the nucleus. It is because there are more neutrons, and the nuclear force is weaker between neutrons than protons and neutrons. So, The bond between 6 protons and 8 neutrons in the nucleus of carbon-14 atom is weaker, making it unstable. It means it tends to become stable, and thus it is radioactive. About the heavier atoms like gold, Au, more neutrons than its protons are required to become stable simply because of the electromagnetic force that is experienced by protons. Look, protons are positively charged particles, meaning it has an electric field around it which experiences electromagnetic force when it interferes with other electric fields. So protons being positive repel each other like two like poles of magnets repel each other. Wait, if protons and protons repel each other, then how it also attracts each other by nuclear force, like I said before? Great question. Protons repel each other, but they are also attracted by strong nuclear force. But this nuclear force is way stronger than the electromagnetic force that repels each other, hence they are attracted. However, this strong nuclear force only works at very short distance, about 1 femtometer or 10 to the power minus 15 meter, and the electric field of proton has longer range. So, lighter atoms which have few protons experience less repulsive force, which is easily handled by a strong nuclear force that binds together. However, as the number of protons increases, the electric field also increases, and the electromagnetic force gets stronger, which tends to repel each other. This leads to a stronger nuclear force to be outpowered by the majority of repulsive forces between protons. In order to balance out this repulsive force, more neutrons are required. As the neutrons increase, strong nuclear force also increases, which is more powerful and helps in binding the nucleus together. So, the gold has 79 protons and 119 neutrons, and it is stable. Now let's understand about carbon dating from beginning. Earth's atmosphere contains about 78% of nitrogen gas. Nitrogen-14 atom has 7 protons and 7 neutrons. Cosmic rays from space contain high-energy particles, mostly protons. These protons collide with the upper atmosphere and produce free neutrons. These free neutrons then interact with nitrogen-14 atoms to produce carbon-14 atoms. Here, nitrogen-14 observes those free neutrons and becomes unstable, and then it undergoes rearrangement that results in the ejection of a proton, and it is left with 6 protons and 8 neutrons, which is carbon-14 atom. The reaction takes place as nitrogen-14 plus neutron gives carbon-14 plus proton. In simple terms, a neutron is observed by nitrogen-14 and then it releases its 1 proton. The atom consists of 7 protons and 7 neutrons, and after the reaction it consists of 6 protons and 8 neutrons, which is no longer nitrogen-14, but a carbon-14 atom. This reaction continuously takes place in the upper atmosphere, which creates new carbon-14 atoms, and the existing carbon-14 atoms on Earth continuously decays, which maintains the ratio of carbon-14 atom on the atmosphere. Carbon-14 atoms decay to form nitrogen atoms. How an unstable, radioactive atom does become stable, decays? Well, different atoms have different processes to decay. Every unstable atom looks for its own way to decay, or become stable, and during the process it emits energy in the form of particles or waves, which is called radiation. This radiation can include alpha, beta, and gamma radiation according to the type of atom and its decay. Alpha radiation is emitted in alpha decay. In this decay, an atom to become stable releases 2 protons and 2 neutrons combined. It means it releases a helium atom which has 2 protons and 2 neurons, but it has no electron when it's emitted and seeks to gain it from the environment. This decay happens in heavier atoms. Beta radiation is atom emitting beta particles in beta decay. Beta particle is a high-energy electron that gets emitted from nucleus of the atom. In beta decay, atom releases an electron that is created inside the nucleus. I'll explain this in a moment. Gamma radiation is emitted in gamma decay. In this decay, atom doesn't release any particle but a mass-less electromagnetic wave like light and X-rays, but stronger. Now, what decay do carbon-14 atom goes through? Carbon-14 atom goes into beta decay. It means it releases beta particles from its nucleus, which is high-energy electron. It is just a regular electron released with high kinetic energy. To become stable, carbon-14 atom turns into nitrogen-14 atom, and in the process it releases a beta particle, which is high-energy electron. For carbon-14 to convert into nitrogen-14, Carbon-14 atom needs one extra proton instead of a neutron. So, the existing neutron in it converts into a proton and it will have 7 protons and 7 neutrons, which is nitrogen-14 atom. When the neutron in carbon-14 atom converts into proton, it releases an electron at high kinetic energy, which is known as beta radiation. This new electron is created inside the neutron. But how is the new electron created? Well, it is created when a neutron turns into a proton. See, neutrons are neutral. Unlike proton, which has positive charge, neutron has no charge. But it can change into a proton, which is positive in charge, and it emits electron, which is negative in charge, to balance out the charge. An American physical chemist, Willard Frank Libby, was awarded a Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his contribution to the team that developed the carbon dating process for the remains of living beings. Living beings consists of 18 to 25% carbon atoms in its body. Scientists knew about this carbon-14 atom before, but what they didn't realize was that the ratio of carbon-14 atom to that of carbon-12 atom in the atmosphere is constant to that in living being while it is alive. It means when the living being is alive, carbon-14 atoms in its body are in the ratio of 1 in every 1 trillion carbon-12 atoms as it is in the atmosphere. It is because while it is alive, it continues to consume plants who take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis from the atmosphere, which contains both carbon-12 and carbon-14 atoms in the constant ratio. So, the plant's body has a constant ratio of carbon-14 atoms, and both the animals who consume plant and the animals who consume other animals that consume the plant have a constant ratio of carbon-14 atoms. Since every living thing has to consume other living thing to stay alive, the carbon-14 atoms ratio is constant in all living body while it is alive. After the living being dies, it no longer takes in carbon and the carbon-14 atoms decay without any new replacement from that point. Those carbon-14 atoms gradually decay and change into nitrogen-14 atom, and in the future we could detect the level of nitrogen atom and calculate the age of the remains of the body from the time it died. We can estimate the age up to 50,000 years because by the time all of the carbon-14 atom would have decayed. How long does the carbon-14 atom take to decay? If you look at the single carbon-14 atom, you cannot predict when it will decay. It could decay immediately after it is created, or it could decay after thousands of years. It is a random process and we cannot predict when it decays. However, if you look at a sample that contains a large number of carbon-14 atoms, then their random decay process starts to take a pattern. To get an idea, 1 gram of organic sample, which is about 1/5 of a grape, contains 100s of billions of carbon-14 atom. So, this large number of atoms consists of all those random atoms that decay at random time. But all these random decaying of individual atoms decays in a pattern. So, plotting the data of decay in a graph makes a curve line, and after calculating it, the half-life of carbon-14 happens to be 5,730 years. What is half-life? Half-life is the time a large group of radioactive atoms take to decay half of its total atoms. For example, a sample that contains a large number of radioactive atoms decays half of its total atoms at a certain period of time. The remaining 50% of the sample takes the same period of time to decay another half of the remaining half. It means 25% of the original samples remain after 2 half-life. So this pattern continues. Similarly, in carbon-14 sample, half of its total number decays after 5,730 years, and another half of the remaining half would decay after next 5,730 years. Again, the remaining 25% decays half of its atoms after 5,730 years, making it total of 12.5% of the original sample after 17,190 years. Note that the ratio of carbon-14 atom is same in all living beings while it's alive. Scientists could use quarter-life 1/4 or 1/3 life 1/3 instead of half-life. However, for the convenience in calculation, they prefer half-life. How did Libby with his team found half-life of carbon-14 to be 5,730 years? Scientists use Geiger counters or scintillation detectors that continuously detect beta particles emitted by the sample. They use a high-concentrated sample of carbon-14 that is created in the lab by blasting neutrons in nitrogen-14. The detector records beta particles emitted every second over the entire experiment period. The data is then analyzed by taking average decay rates at specific time intervals, for example, every hour. Even though 5,730 years is the half-life, scientists can detect decay behavior in seconds, minutes, or hours using highly concentrated samples. Instead of waiting for thousands of years, they measure how fast the decay rate drops over short periods and figure out the curve mathematically. Yes, scientists measured decay rates over short periods, minutes, hours, or days, for artificially enriched samples and plotted the data. The observed exponential drop in decay rate over time confirmed that radioactive decay follows a predictable pattern, leading to the discovery of carbon-14's half-life of 5,730 years. Now that we know the half-life of the carbon-14 atom is 5,730 years, we can calculate the age of the organic sample by measuring the amount of carbon-14 atoms left in it. The sample is measured using a technique called accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, which allows for precise measurement of even very small amounts of carbon-14 by counting the individual atoms directly. When the living organism is alive, the ratio of carbon-14 atom is maintained, and after it dies, the remaining carbon-14 atoms only decays and gradually decreases over time. Its sample is then tested in the future where they measure how much of carbon-14 atom is remaining in it, compared to its carbon-12 atoms, and then calculate the time since it was alive. Lower the ratio of carbon-14 to that of carbon-12 in it, older the sample is. This is how carbon dating works. Thank you very much.